I think we'll be able to conduct this one a little bit faster today. Some of the content has changed, and some of it is, been throughout this time updates to different items. We're recording this and making this session available to our members to review not only the recording but also the PowerPoint slides afterwards. So I think even with a limited number of participants, I think there's going to be some reach beyond this. I do also know some people contacted me and said they couldn't make it because they had other conflicts, but they'd be looking through the content thereafter. With that said, I want to thank Bell Bank and Mortgage, our sponsors, North Star MLS, Royal Credit Union, and Supra. Without their support for this program and many others that MAW brings forward, we make it very, very difficult for the association to do its job effectively on behalf of members. This session was recently rebranded to Gab with Your GAD. Previous to this, it was called COVID-19 Response. We believe that with that kind of titling, it was being missed by some of our members, but hopefully not. Hopefully Gab with Your GAD catches on, and we hope to do these into the future on a regular basis. So far, it's been weekly at 1 on Mondays at 1 p.m., and here we are. So June 1st, can't believe it's already here. My name is Eric Myers, Director of Government Affairs for the Minneapolis Association of Realtors since 2017. Bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Minnesota, and I've been lobbying in Minnesota for 20 years. I've represented the realtors for 12 years since February 2008. I was formerly the SPAR Government Affairs Director for about a 10-year period. I worked in the Minnesota House, the Minnesota Senate, legislative campaign staff, door-to-door, knocking on people's houses, getting them to vote. And I worked on a statewide issue advocacy campaign with the Freedom to Breathe law in Minnesota. Also worked in a large advocacy practice at a law firm, and that exposed me to many of the business elements of signing up clients and client relations and a wide breadth of different industries representing in that time. So my role during the pandemic and now during civil unrest has changed a little bit. My normal role is to track local governments, Hennepin County and the foremost immediately surrounding counties thereafter, and then the 100 cities underneath those counties. During the pandemic, I shifted my approach to watching all levels of government, from the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate, and even executive orders coming out of the president's office, and then back here at home in the state as well. Executive orders coming out of the governor's office and coming out of the Minnesota House and Senate. New guidance from HUD, IRS, Treasury, and others. And then adding here the monitoring of protests, violence, curfews, and other government response. So there's some of that in here. There's not a lot of that in here. This is not the place for the association to have a ton of commentary. I don't have a ton of commentary on the civil unrest. I may mention a few things. Nothing in here is purported to take a position one way or the other on how things are going or not going. It's just to provide updates on what might be impacting your business from a government perspective. So there are some resources. The Minneapolis Area Association of Realtors COVID-19 resource page has had a ton of information on it since the beginning. We just updated one of the forbearance section on this just this last week, so that's very relevant too. And there's been some changes in that area, and we'll cover some of those. The Minnesota Association of Realtors has a really nice, robust FAQ document, and of course, NAR is always there. Deep resources on resources and issue guidance at this national association. What I try to do is help bring that information forward for you and kind of weed through it. So, but if there's ever any questions that go beyond or that we can't answer from this presentation or others, we're definitely going to get you connected. Minnesota stay-at-home orders, realtors were essential. Foreclosures and evictions have been suspended, both via a presidential order and governor's orders, and we'll talk about those. The essential order was specific to facilitating transactions and included these categories. Stay Safe was the program that came out after Stay Home, and we'll talk about some of those as well. Obviously, Minnesota curfews and highway closures and other things have been forthcoming in the last few days as well. So just want to be aware of those things and try to be in compliance. So obviously guidance on staying safe, washing your hands, getting tested, maintaining the distance, wearing a mask, staying home when able, and just constant vigilance on this. And then there's been some guidance, and there will be some in this presentation about new things that are opening up starting today. And we'll see how that progresses from here. So I do want to cover that the Minnesota Peacetime Emergency extends through June 12th, 2020. This is important to realtors because of an Executive Order 2014, go back, sorry. Executive Order 2014 suspends evictions and writs of recovery during the peacetime emergency. So during this period, up till now, since about March 18th or so, and through June 12th, you cannot evict someone physically from their home. This is also obviously, they could be in violation of their lease, and normally your eviction process could have started. You just cannot do that under this executive order through this date. What happens after June 12th is an evolving issue, and there's a question. Will the peacetime emergency be extended? Will it be canceled? Will it be changed? But just understand that the existence of the peacetime emergency is what keeps this order in place. If there's questions about that, we can take some of those, but I think that's pretty clear. There is the state of Minnesota does have a dashboard, and there's a lot of information on it. And one of them is just a reminder of how many confirmed cases we've had via testing so far. This is not a commenting on testing or have we had enough or too much or anything like that. But the state of Minnesota does have this number of confirmed cases as of this morning, and this number of deaths. And then you can actually go in and break it down by county and see how that all lays out. And then there's links to other information here too about the government's response, cases and demographics, how to stay safe, and the dial back dashboard has some great charts on it too. There's a lot of information in there, and I'm not going to take you through all of that, but just know that if you want to dive in deep to the details, they are available to you. As you know, the governor's been talking about shifting these dials over time, and they've moved to single shops and gatherings of less than 10 people. And I had about 5 or 6 of these slides in previously because these dials had constantly been moving from left to right. And there's been no change to the distance learning piece, obviously. But I took them out of this presentation just for posterity because this is where we are right now, and there's some more information about that as well. So if you land on that Stay Safe MN Minnesota page, it'll walk you through each of this chart, and it goes on to the next slide as well. The setting, the condition, the phases, when they start, and information about these individual pieces. So you all remember some time ago that non-critical businesses, only critical businesses were open, and then non-critical businesses opened thereafter. Retail was at curbside pickup before, and now it's at 50% capacity open, and you can see that here with lining up with beginning June 1st. And then it goes on and on through restaurants and bars and personal services, gyms, and this entire dashboard is something you can go to and look at. And it keeps going here: entertainment, outdoor, school buildings, childcare, youth programming, organized sports, places of worship, which have been the subject of a lawsuit that's ongoing. And then here's the link to land at this page. So if you're wondering if some category is open according to the state and whether it's okay for that category to be open, click this link, follow through to this chart, and then look through these details on this chart. This is a little more expansive than just the dials have been previous to this. So this is brand new. You still some iconography about washing your hands and get tested and staying 6 feet apart. And then obviously with the riots and the violence that started after this incident last week, Monday, this is a horrible incident, and the Minneapolis area realtors, put this message out on Facebook and sent it an all-member communication to all 10,000 members just this last Friday. and Minneapolis does condemn these actions. The Minneapolis Association condemns these actions, and definitely calls for justice and accountability. And I think there will be more efforts from the association, more information, more communications about some of the things the association and our members individually are going to do to try to help during these times. So I just know that there's nothing more I can say about this that brings any kind of we're all hurting. We understand that, and we all grieve in different ways, and the impacts of this are felt throughout the community. There's really not much more that can be said at this time in this sense, but this message did go out. The executive committee and the board discussed it, and this is the statement they came up with. Just some details. You were all aware of the curfew, but whenever there's orders in place locally and they have the effect of law, then I'm going to grab the actual definitions and the actual proclamations and the individual elements of that law and bring them forward to you so that you see them and so that we share them with our members. So Minneapolis curfew details, they were in place on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday on these dates during these times, and it had this effect of law. People were arrested for just being out after these times. It was reported initially that a lot of those people being arrested were from out of state, but then it was later reported that some of those folks were arrested that also lived in the state. So there's a lot of people out there with good intentions. There's some people out there with bad intentions, and they tend to infiltrate the crowd. But the reality is this was the order. These were the curfew dates and times. Here's how it applied. It includes you couldn't be on foot, bicycle, skateboard, scooter, motorcycle, so on and so forth. Yes, there was an exception for emergency, but you were also subject to a misdemeanor and which in Minnesota is a fine up to $1,000 or imprisonment in jail for not more than 90 days. So there was also in the Star Tribune just understanding that this is a real estate update. And I'm not talking about the wider social justice issues here, but since this is a real estate update, the Minneapolis St. Paul Star Tribune did write this story here, and you can click to it. And this is an updated list of damaged buildings and businesses. So you can read through that top to bottom and see I know a lot of you saw the devastation in your neighborhoods and in your community, but you can look through this list and take a look at the list that they have ongoing. It's my understanding that they intend to kind of keep this list rolling for a little while and have some access to it. So maybe that helps people in terms of helping back out in the community or understanding which businesses were most impacted, reaching out to people that that are in those businesses and in those sectors and seeing if there's anything you can do. It's provided here since this is a real estate update.
Eric, I just wanted to jump in real quick. I apologize. Carson is making the note that the curfew is actually in place for the next 2 nights as well.
That's good to know. And it wasn't, they may have amended that original order, and I checked it this morning, and it just hadn't been updated to their website yet. So very good to know. Curfew for the next 2 nights as well. So be aware. I'm sure they just amended the dates, and so all the rest of the definitions apply in terms of what you can do, where you can go, why, when you can't, and so on. Thank you, Carson. Going back a little bit here, remembering that the entire crisis is not just about what's recently happened within the last week. It's been what's been going on for the last 10 or 11 weeks. And the National Association of Realtors has a guide that you can access at this link. It's a customizable brochure that you can drop your logo and your information on, and it helps you start the conversation with your consumers about forbearance. If any of your consumers find themselves in the situation where they can't pay their mortgage and then considering a forbearance, obviously they need to reach out to their lender and find out what's going on. But this is some information designed by NAR to help you start that conversation with them. And there's different programs that are available if you're conventional or if it's a secondary government-backed mortgage. So just be aware of some of those. And initially, when it came to forbearance, there was some concerns that if you took a forbearance that, and it was an FHA-backed mortgage, a government-backed mortgage, that you'd never be able to refinance again, or that you wouldn't be able to do a home purchase again in the future because you utilized the forbearance. And this guidance from FA says, no, after 3 months of being caught back up on the forbearance and making those 3 consecutive payments, the government's going to treat the use of that forbearance, the successful use of that forbearance, as if it didn't happen. No further penalties into the future. So just be aware of that. Of course, this does not extend to conventional mortgages, and the terms are going to be specific to what the bank offers there. Unemployment and stimulus, I think I'm going to skip over this. A lot of people know that 1099 employees, realtors are eligible for unemployment, and a lot have applied and gotten it. So, and then stimulus checks too, based on income. Paper checks began in May and will continue through June. There's a note here about deceased people that have received checks and what the guidance is and what they should do about it. There are instructions from IRS via this link. Some of this information is provided to realtors because you may talk to a consumer tomorrow that needs this information. It's not that you necessarily need it at your fingertips right away today, but next time you talk to a consumer that does need this information, then you're aware of it. Just some unemployment numbers, and these haven't been updated since through the end of May yet. We're looking to update these soon through the end of May, and you can just see some comparison with where we were with the Great Depression, and then how some of these have the unemployment has impacted different ethnic groups. So unemployment by race as well. So just some comparisons there to kind of give you overall perspective, how it's impacted people by education level, and which sectors on the right-hand side were impacted the most. Job losses by sector. And those are national numbers. Pandemic unemployment assistance. If you're a realtor and you're a 1099 employee, for the first time ever in the history of the country, you are eligible for unemployment assistance, and you have to report your earnings weekly. And should a week come up that you earn more than your PUA unemployment amount, then your unemployment will be treated accordingly, all the way down to down to 0 for that week. But that doesn't necessarily preclude you from any further weeks. So, and there's some information about that and a link to Deed to get more information. Congress did repeal the PPP program, and so far I have not heard that it has run out. The PPP program offers small business loans through your community lenders and big lenders to small businesses, sole proprietors, and independent contractors and self-employed with less than 500 employees. A similar program has always been available from SBA with similar customers being served, but EIDL, you apply directly with the SBA, and PPP, you apply directly with your lender. There are some uses here, what they're for, and on PPP, it's very important that you get the uses correct, because there's a whole new set of guidance right now that allows you, if you get everything right and you keep on track with paying the right categories of items, then your loan could be considered forgivable up to 100%. There's also a sliding scale, and then it could be not forgiven all the way down to 0. But based on your level of tracking and filling out the form and expending the funds correctly with the program guidance. And that guidance has changed a little bit throughout time, and we'll talk about some of the things that are being proposed in this world as well. So here's the term sheet, that who it applies to, how much you can get, what the terms are, what the length is, and then PPP was designed so that you keep people employed during an 8-week period. And so I have some updates on the next slide on some of that. So And then again, just a reminder that PPP, you applied directly through your local bank or credit union, and EIDL was through and directly with the SBA. Next here. So the Minneapolis Association of Realtors and the National Association of Realtors has received the 11-page guidance from SBA on the PPP loan forgiveness program. And so click this link. It's going to take you to an 11-page PDF. If you've gotten PPP money and you're looking on how to accurately follow the guidance and apply for the forgiveness, which I assume you're going to want to. You took this loan out and there was mention of forgiveness on the front end, so you're going to want to effectuate that. Follow this guidance on this link and work yourself through the document and to give yourself the best chance of getting 100% forgiveness or the highest percentage you can. There has been some changes proposed, and the U.S. House of Representatives, our own Congressman Dean Phillips, a Democrat from the Minnesota 3rd District, which reaches through Edina, Eden Prairie, and all over Mar territory. He introduced a bipartisan piece of legislation in the House. He had a Republican co-sponsor, and some of the provisions were to extend the forgiveness period from beyond 8 weeks to 24 weeks, dispense with the 75% FTE forgiveness employee kept on payroll rule. And Phillips said the inability to cover non-payroll expenses are existential threat to many businesses. So kind of expand the categories by which the loan funds are useful, and eliminate restrictions that limit the terms to 2 years, and instead wants to open up a 5 to 10 year rule on the loans. This goes to the idea that some of these loans may not end up being considered forgiven, and you may be at this point best to help businesses by giving them a longer term. And then ensure that businesses take PPP loans, get full access, still get full access to payroll tax deferment. There was some question with PPP whether businesses were technically double dipping by taking PPP loans and payroll tax deferment. And this bill with this provisions would allow them to take advantage of both programs. And then it would extend the rehiring date to December 31st and offset the effect of enhanced unemployment insurance on employees' willingness to return to work. So that just means that this would push out that you didn't have to bring people back right away at the end of 8 weeks or the couple weeks there beyond that you'd have through the end of the year to try to slowly bring things on. This is just to try to get some of these businesses to more smoothly turn the light switch back on at the factory, so to speak. So this bill has passed the U.S. House of Representatives. We do expect some action on a very similar bill in the U.S. Senate this week. We know it's the subject of conversation. We have to hand it to Congressman Dean Phillips that he put a very straightforward, helpful bill forward, and that it's very targeted and it's very apropos. It's very appropriate at this moment. And so I think we should give credit where credit is due that this has passed the House. We should hope and watch the U.S. Senate this week and into next week. It's not exactly this piece of legislation that they're bringing up. So we're going to want to stay engaged on this and make sure whatever changes are proposed in the Senate also kind of fit the same spirit and the same intent as this program. And hopefully very soon there can be some changes on this. To that extent, this is a national issue, so NER has issued this letter to Dean Phillips and to Dean Phillips and his Republican counterpart on this bill, and to some of the folks that are involved in this legislation moving forward. And the National Association of Realtors is in favor of this by and large. And in this paragraph in the middle of this document talks about how some of the restrictions in PPP so far have been deleterious to business, and that some changes would be needed. So NAR does support this rule change, and if you needed the link to this document and you needed access to this document, that link is right here. Maybe stop here for some questions. Are there any questions so far?
You're doing such an excellent job of covering the topics that we don't have any questions right now.
Okay. All right. Well,
Please type in if you have one.
Yeah, and if people are catching up, I'm happy to cover anything at any time, even if it's kind of off timing. I know webinars aren't the best for, hey, what about this or what about that necessarily, but feel free. Most things aren't going to be out of bounds here. There were some other CARES Act provisions, and I have left this slide in this presentation throughout. Student loans that are backed by the U.S. government, no payments for 6 months, no interest, and no penalties. Some information on accessing your retirement funds was included in the CARE Act. Check with your plan administrator, check with your accountant, but it may be possible to access some of those funds if you need them. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017 had reduced the charitable deduction for non-itemizers. The CARES Act restored $300 worth of the charitable deduction for your 2020 taxes for non-itemizers. Obviously for itemizers as well, but that hadn't been taken away from itemizers, and it's now been restored to itemizers. Employee retention credits, delay of employee payroll taxes, the tax deadlines for 1031 exchanges, tax opportunity zones, and the regular tax deadline have all been extended to July 15th. Was there a question that popped up there, Amy? No?
Yeah, well, Vicki was asking, I just want to share, Vicki was asking if there were any others on the call besides her company that they have received PPP funds, and she's sharing that it's frustrating that the goalposts have moved in play. So I was just reaching out to see if anybody else had any comments for Vicki or could respond if there's any others. Carson is sharing that they have in their company. So yeah.
Yeah, I can speak to that. It is frustrating that the program's goalposts have moved and continue to move throughout. Hopefully that this effort from Phillips is to move it in the direction of business and not away from it. So that's helpful to know that people are lining up on the right side of this issue. I will say that in comparison to, over 10 years ago during the start of the last financial crisis, which truly was a housing crisis, housing created crisis and a foreclosure crisis, it took them 3 years to come out with 2 to 3 years to come out with mortgage modifications and other programs. And they literally invented PPP in a 2-week period. And so I absolutely understand and agree with the frustration. The reality is, though, that Congress invented PPP in a 2-week period, and it was rolling out the program and offering it to businesses before it ever had the backside regulations and path to forgiveness even completed. So, yeah, I guess you got to pick the devil that's worse there. Getting a program that rolled out and we don't have all the back end details, or a complete delay in the program that could have been even more catastrophic. I guess we just may never know on that one. The Minnesota legislature, you guys all caught this. The $1.5 billion surplus has turned into a 2.4626 deficit. There was a bonding battle. They didn't get a bonding bill done. The legislature did adjourn on May 18th. The undone list includes bonding and ratification of workers, some workers in the Minnesota that were set to receive increases in July, and then legislative oversight of the CARES Act and other economic aid and tax relief for the pandemic. At that time, the legislature and the governor had agreed that there'll probably be a special session at some point. And I would just say, even since that time, and they were initially looking at a June 12th special session, like middle of June. And I will just say, since that time, the world has changed again completely in the last 7-8 days. So what's going to happen from the Minnesota legislative standpoint, I couldn't even venture to begin to tell you at this point. Will they proceed and have their special session immediately and keep it to these lists of items that are undone, or will it be brought up, and other issues that we've experienced since will be also on the subject? I will say this: the governor has the right to call a special session, and the legislature has the right to end a special session. So understand how that plays. The governor is very likely not going to call a special session. Generally, they don't call a special session without some agreement ahead of time of what the scope of the work might be. So I would think in the next couple weeks, you're going to hear at least some discussion about what the scope should be for a special session before a special session were to ever be called. Was there another question?
Yes, Carson was just commenting that he can't imagine the deficit.
Yeah, let me go forward.
It's not quite a double, but it's a big jump.
Yeah, you can kind of see here, Carson and others, what the changes have been. This was the May projection, and these are the changes. So there's the $3.6 billion change, with the bottom line being 1.5 flush on the front end, so 1.5 plus negative 3.6. And you can see the impacted categories. The income taxes, certainly when people are out of work, they weren't paying income tax. The general sales tax, when people are out of work, they're not spending as much except for on essentials. Corporate franchise tax and other revenue, just all down. And here's that budgetary math. You have the surplus, you have the revenue being projected as this much less. You have estimated spending having gone up, trying to deal with COVID. And then the stadium reserve is this projected reserve right here, and it went down. So you add this math together and you come up with the budgetary deficit. I will say this though, during the Dayton administration, there was a law that was passed that requires the legislature, they've got a balanced budget requirement constitutionally in Minnesota. They are required to balance the budget, but just timeline wise, they're not required to balance the budget in 2020. They are required to balance the budget by the end of 2021, which comes up by June 30th of 2021. So by the middle of next year is when they need to have the balanced budget. Now, 2.3 during the Dayton administration, they did put rainy day funds aside, and 2.35 billion remain in the rainy day funds. So you go back and you say, well, a $2.4 billion deficit offset by nearly $2.4 billion in rainy day funds, that's essentially zero. That is an argument that can be made, but I will say that you have to understand here that to expend any of these funds, there's no automatic expenditure of these funds that mitigate the impact. Any use of these funds must be authorized by the legislature to mitigate the impact. So, and it's not the only source. I mean, you could look at tax increases. You could look at layoffs in the state, program cutting. There are many different approaches. And once you start talking about the tools to fix this problem, then the politics and the philosophy on how to balance your budget becomes clearly defined, and we kind of get our general conservative versus progressive, Democrat versus Republican natural responses to these budget issues. Just understanding some other emergency orders. Minneapolis has passed an emergency order 2020-12, and this is the order that requires places of public accommodations that employees and people visiting them, that a cloth face covering is required, and that it was, so it was effective on May 26th. This is the emergency. This is the use of a mask required in the city of Minneapolis. Now, you guys all see these updates and these stories in the newspaper, but the newspaper doesn't put the actual text of the effectual parts of the ordinance and the orders right in front of you. And I'm going to continue to reach out and bring that information forward. So here's the information. Here's what it means. You could get an administrative citation or be prosecuted with a misdemeanor if you don't follow these. There is some any individual over the age 2 and able to medically tolerate a face mask. So if you have a young child that's 2 or less and they can't tolerate it, or you have someone that can't tolerate it because of a medical condition like an allergy or impaired breathing, then these folks are not going to be required with the doctor's permission to cover their face. Everyone is going to be asked to cover their face under this order as long as you can medically tolerate it. So just some information there to be aware of. And then just kind of the last thing, some evolving issues, definitely with the riots. The top of mind now is definitely, and right at the forefront of conversation, is the need for systemic change. Minnesota has some of the largest housing gaps for Indigenous and Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the United States. That does go along with, to be clear, it does go along that Minnesota has some of the highest home ownership rates in the country as well. And so that's what makes that gap even larger by comparison. But the gap itself is not explained simply by that. So by Black, Indigenous, and people of color, people in Minnesota have a huge housing gaps, meaning that just means they don't own, they're not homeowners at the same percentage as white folks. So those gaps have persisted, and there's a real focus on that over the last, even prior to the recent trauma that we've all experienced in the last 8 days, 7-8 days. But there was a lot of focus on this, and the Minneapolis Association of Realtors I serve on the Minnesota Homeownership Alliance Association with the Minnesota Homeownership Center and with Minnesota Housing. So there is a group that's convened at the statewide, kind of across sectors within the housing, to be focused on some of these, and their efforts are always underway in terms of trying to help close these gaps and get us new homeowners. The reality is closing these housing gaps in Minnesota just creates new homeowners, and new homeowners now feed your business well into the future with repeat buying and move up buying and just the whole chain all the way down. So don't want to cover too much more than that, but just the need for systemic change and then closing the housing gaps. That's kind of how it impacts real estate and kind of where it focuses from here. There's still questions about a second round of stimulus. There's still questions about whether there's more federal guidance coming on foreclosures and evictions. There's an interplay between that and federally chartered banks with private contracts with their consumers. How does that all work? We are looking for more state guidance on foreclosures and evictions, specifically what happens after June 12th. Do we get to go back to, is the guidance going to be, okay, now you can evict anyone that hasn't paid? Or is there going to be new guidance? Or is the emergency, peacetime emergency going to be extended? And then there's questions about the intersection of these policy programs, just like that was already brought up. You know, it's frustrating to get PPP and then have the rules change, but it's nice to have PPP having come out at all. But we are dedicated to trying to bring you those rules. There was a point when, you know, today during PPP, I was able to point you to the link with 11-page guidance on that program and how to get your PPP program loan you know, forgiven. And there was a period for a couple weeks there where we didn't have that guidance at all. So just as you don't have the guidance, we're sitting here waiting, where's the guidance? But I'm out there checking every day if there's new information. So PPP, EIDL, PUA, repayment, just a lot of questions there. And then, you know, there's still a lot of focus on maybe some increased pay for frontline workers, nurses, and store stockers and truckers and just folks that are out there delivering those critical service businesses that keeping us all safe during COVID, and certainly also during civil unrest as well. So a lot there, a lot of things to be considered. You know, just a week after some of the violence, I think people are still reeling, but I would expect more and more discussions in the policy realm on this and many more issues. So with that, that's the end of my presentation. If you ever have any questions, you can email me or call me, and we're going to run these monthly, and they are recorded, and they're available on the association's weekly newsletter via the recording and the link to the PowerPoint slides. Are there any more questions? Happy to answer any questions if there are.
It doesn't appear there's any questions, but you covered some great information. A lot to think about.
Yeah, and I appreciate questions like and contributions from Carson and others, and quite clearly, I'm trying to aggregate all this information and bring it forward for you. But if you see something that I haven't seen yet, like the curfews have been updated, that's all great. Please send that my way. Like the example was today that I had checked the order this morning. The order hadn't changed online, at least, but maybe obviously through the city's official functions, they had already put out that information. So, and I'm monitoring those as well, but you can see how there's a disconnect about what the message is on TV and radio, and that they don't necessarily always update their back-end online systems. So, and if anyone has questions that go up to that take you up to the federal issues, or you have questions and you need answers back from NAR or the state association or locally, please reach out to me, and I'm happy to help connect you with the right resources and get you the answers you need during this critical time.
Eric, Kelly popped in a question. Are you aware of any road closures tonight?
You know, I didn't follow that for the purposes of this update. I'm sure there will continue to be guidance. I saw the same map you did the other night. That was, you know, a lot of the major arterial trunk highways, you know, in the kind of inside the core were closed. Yeah, I would stay tuned to DPS for that, the Department of Public Safety. You know, maybe pull that up later in the afternoon. That might be a good time each day as we go through the next few days to pull up the Department of Public Safety website and just land there and see what the updates are. Obviously, you know, stay tuned to the official sources you use, like WCCO and Care 11 and others, traffic management apps, things like that. But, you know, I would, if you have something planned in the evening, I'd be aware of the situation. I'd be willing to adjust and be fluid. And then, but do plan ahead and look ahead. So if I'm going somewhere about 4, 5, 6 o'clock at night, I'm going to be looking at 1, 2, and 3 to see if there's any updates before venturing out.
Yeah, it looks like 2 have shared that there will be closures tonight, and MnDOT does have a map up of what's going to be closed. So
yeah, and I just think for all of us, for our safety, for our clients' safety, we just have to be very fluid. You know, certainly there's going to be places where that are unimpacted, and then there's going to be places where there's a great deal of impact, and you know, just because there's no impact there right now doesn't mean there won't be in a couple hours. So just being a little more aware than whatever might be considered normal. I hate the word, but yeah, just being a little more aware and planning ahead. I think that really helps us all. It just keeps ourselves and our clients safe.
yeah. Well said.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Thanks, Eric.
Yep.
As always, we're lucky to have you on staff at MAR.
Well, we just hope this is helpful, and it's information you can bring back to your offices and share with in your brokerage meetings and amongst your clients as well. And maybe someone says to you, hey, you know, I haven't seen the PPP guidance, and you just say to yourself, nope, you know, Eric just told me about it. Let me dig through that. Here's the link. You know, so hopefully we're connecting you in those ways as well.
Absolutely. Have a great rest of the day, everyone.
Great. Thank you.
Stay safe. Thank you.